This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
I'd like to direct you all to the website for the California Council on the Humanities, and as well as thank them for inviting us and all of us here and all of you. I did not get a chance to see that. Did you see the panel on the Pluralistic Society?
I did.
I did not.
Okay, well, you're outnumbered, and so we're going to go blind on this. And partly what we're hoping to look at is there's been a lot of talk about, and it's not necessarily there's not necessarily a consensus about it, but that things are changing. That somehow the election of Barack Obama is a reflection of some sort of a fundamental shift in how race is dealt with in the United States. I think whether that's been proven or not, whether that's true or not, is almost irrelevant. There is a perception that something has happened, and some people find that a good thing, and others fear it. And I think what we wanted for the both of you, and I should say that Professor Lipsitz is sick and he has a bad flu, and he emailed earlier today, and he's sorry that he could not make it. Is to delve into the notion of number one. Has anything changed, Lisa, in regards, let's start with you. I mean, just on the very fundamental level, has the way race is dealt with, in particular in the United States, changed in the last 30 years?
I guess the answer is yes and no, right? I mean, the reality of the situation—
That's a safe start, but that's okay.
Well, the reality of the situation is the civil rights movement deconstructed the legal infrastructure that legally supported state-sanctioned discrimination against African Americans and other communities of color. So that has definitely changed. I think what that did is it changed housing patterns, it changed to some extent access to educational institutions, it changed socioeconomic mobility for sectors within those communities. What it didn't do was obviate the inequalities that exist across racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And so I think what has happened in the post-civil rights era is a need, and I think, pundits and academics and folks who study race have not come up with a good vocabulary to talk about how do you talk about the structural inequality that exists in the United States and the degree to which it falls along racial lines, while understanding and appreciating that there's diversity within those communities and there's more opportunities to some extent within those communities than there was previous to the civil rights era. And so finding a balance between those two things to understand that race still does delineate the life chances for many people within the United States while still allowing more movement than had existed previously, and the increase in interracial marriage and other things that really kind of complicate the racial picture. I think we don't do a very good job of talking about those two things. Somehow people on the right tend to say because you have successful African Americans, that means race doesn't exist. And people on the left sort of say it's all about race. And the answer probably lies somewhere in between. But I think as a society, we're not very good about talking about structures and the ways in which people are limited by structures. And I think in that way, the election of Barack Obama speaks to that complexity.
Usually wait an hour and a half into a panel to get the level of that sophistication. But we started out with it. So that was brilliant. And I'm wondering, though, if you could break it down for us a bit. I mean, what is the vocabulary we need? And could you give us an instance? I mean, you did just give us an instance of how the vocabulary, how the existence of successful African Americans does not mean race doesn't matter. But I'm wondering if you could articulate a moment in which that vocabulary is just simply so clearly absent, and whether you yourself, why have you not developed and given to the world that vocabulary that you say is missing?
Well, clearly I'm not smart enough. No. I guess I will give you an instance, like in my life, that showed to me we have a long way to go. So when I moved to the Bay Area 3 years ago, and we were looking for houses in Oakland, and in the city of Oakland, pretty much all of the high schools in the city of Oakland have about 30% of the student population that's testing at grade level. And whatever you want to say about standardized testing and whether it's an accurate measure and all those kinds of things, the fact of the matter is those schools are failing a vast majority of their students, an overwhelming majority of their students, and most of those students are Black and brown students. And part of me couldn't believe that no one was outraged by that, right? That these schools are allowed to keep going, and the reason people aren't outraged, I think, is because fundamentally people think it's the kids' fault. Right, that somehow they're not smart enough, that idea, that there must be some remnant of that idea that somehow these communities just can't get their act together, rather than saying we're wasting this whole generation of potential in these kids. And so how do we talk about that? How do we say that, yes, there are many Latino and African American kids at Berkeley 2 miles away, but that those kids in Oakland are living 2 worlds away from that institution? And how can those two things exist simultaneously?
Right. Now, Dawn, you won't let me call him Professor. Dawn, you study primarily religion and civic engagement, and you have some findings about, which I found sort of counterintuitive, about pluralism. And in your case, you're finding, and I'm going to put the words in your mouth, and perhaps you can then save me from it, that pluralism is actually creating certain levels of tolerance among in relationships among people of different racial backgrounds. Could you explain that? And why is that so? And is that different than, let's say, racial diversity?
Well, first, a reflection on an NPR program I heard driving here this morning, which was analyzing very recent census data. And one thing that struck me in this analysis is that 1 in 7 of all new marriages, individuals are marrying across racial and ethnic lines. And I just found that extremely interesting. Also, just thinking about recent news, I believe yesterday was the anniversary of the Rodney King beating.
Yeah.
And of course, a year from now is when the '92 riots or uprisings or civil unrest, whatever name one uses, was unleashed. And one interesting thing is that I very carefully tried to track what was happening in the religious community in '92. And first of all, the media turned to African American clergy, such as Cecil Murray at First AME Church, to interpret what was occurring. But the other thing that happened in the next year, and then it lasted maybe another 2 or 3 years, was a lot of interfaith activity, particularly suburban white congregations trying to create some kind of partnership with congregations in South LA. Some of those were successful, some were not. Actually, Jewish congregations trying to create partnerships with Black congregations and so forth. So I think one sign that is hopeful is that actually, thinking back to '92, I think it was a kind of watershed moment. But also, I'm intrigued that even though Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour of the week, if we think about who's in church, temple, synagogue, there are lots of anecdotes and actually an emerging literature talking about interracial congregations. So, for example, a good friend of mine who was at First AME started a congregation now, maybe it's been 7 or 8 years ago, in Irvine. He has a very interracial congregation, and of all places, Irvine. So he may have all the African Americans and all of Irvine in his congregation.
Or they drive a long way.
Right.
I actually have a friend in that congregation. Yes, they're all there.
So they're all there.
They're all there.
So that accounts for the Black folks in that church. But then it's an interesting mixture, including interracial couples who can somehow find a home there. So to speak more particularly to your point about pluralism, though,
And religion.
and religion, I think there is something unique in our Constitution that does not allow formally for the establishment of religion or favoritism towards any particular religion. And particularly taking LA as the context, but I would say nationally, there's a sense in which you can be anything you want to be. And there's an enormous amount of religious switching that occurs, of people who grew up Roman Catholic, who decide to be Protestant Episcopalians, or increasingly people who grew up religious who choose to be none. So I think right now, something like 17% of the population is secular. They don't claim any religious connection
And that's
at
the
all.
fastest growing group, right?
Fastest growing group, and there's something very legitimate about it. In fact, I won't be surprised in another century, maybe another 10 or 15 years, that we could have a president elected who is doesn't claim a religious affiliation. We obviously have had a Roman Catholic president. Who knows, we might even get a Mormon president. I mean, that would, I'm not arguing for
Lisa
that.
has
I'm just
no
saying,
comment about that.
that's a possibility. We might, I mean, we almost had a Jewish
Vice president.
and so forth. I mean, these are things that in a sense would not have been conceivable 100 years ago. So I do think that there is something about our pluralism religiously that is actually breeding tolerance. And, you know, if we were just to ask the religious background of this panel, I won't do that, by the way. My guess is we're all something different. And certainly in this audience, we're all something different. So we have neighbors who are something else. We work with people who are different than we are. And there's a sense in which religiously, I think we're extremely tolerant. And that may not translate into race and ethnicity specifically.
I think you indicated to me on the telephone that 9/11 had played a role that I may not have expected regarding the treatment and alliances made with American Muslims.
So prior to 9/11, if you went to an interfaith gathering, you would expect to see a Protestant, a Catholic, and a Jew. Now, I could not go to any interfaith event that does not also have at least one, if not more, Muslims. And actually, then you typically see a Mormon and so forth and so on. So while I certainly don't want to argue that there's not discrimination against Muslims, because obviously there is, and I've heard many horror stories from close friends of mine, there's another sense in which Muslims are inevitably now included in major civic events, whether it be the inauguration of a president or some civic event here in Los Angeles.
Lisa, Don mentioned the NPR report this morning and the 1 in 7 marriages in the U.S. that's interethnic or interracial. How does that complicate the way we talk about race and the way we conceive race?
I mean, the problem is in the United States, historically, we have these things called one-drop rules, right? The racial hierarchy was established as kind of a biological bloodline, and that so you had one drop of black blood, you were black. And so our vocabulary was not able to incorporate the idea of admixture, right? You were sort of, white blood is corrupted, and therefore can no longer be white, you are of whatever other side. So I think we still, in sense of understanding mixed race, I think we don't know very much about how it works. We don't know very much how race operates for those individuals, the degree to which they feel that their ascriptive characteristics affect the way people interact with them. The one interesting factoid on that front that I know about, at least among Latinos, when Latinos marry whites, the kids are most likely to identify as Latinos than as whites. They don't identify as mixed, and especially if the mom is Latina. So that's the other question, is to what degree, what then is the identity that comes out of those relationships? And so this is not something I've looked at, so I'd be interested to know kind of how it breaks down by different racial groups and percentages. And then we don't know enough about those kids to really know how that's going to, I mean, I think they disrupt the discourse, right? Because they go against this whole principle that was in American history, but that principle was always a false one and a constructed one, because you've always had mixture throughout American history.
Go ahead, sorry.
It was just defined differently by society,
Right.
in the sense of what the meaning of it was.
So whether or not we can prove it yet, you're implying that the increase in the number of interracial and interethnic marriages has the potential to, as you put it, disrupt the discourse as we've conducted it thus far.
At least disrupt the social construction of race in the ways in which how it's seen to operate in American society, and the number of categories, the way that those categories are interpreted. But in the end, I think it's important to realize this has always been a social construction. So on some level, this is no different from what has happened before. What the question is really, what are going to be the values and meanings attached to those children's descriptive characteristics, in which case race is going to be operating in much of the similar way that
this is a loaded question, a leading question, but it's been suggested that Barack Obama has missed an opportunity to take us to talk about mixture to the American public. I think he talked about the adopting the dog, and the dog was like him. Remember, that was his first week. The dog was a mutt. But that's the last we've heard of mixture from the president, and the president has a very unique history and a very exemplary one. Did he miss an opportunity to talk about that?
He did. In his speech on race, he talks about that very explicitly. I think the fact that he is not seen in those terms, but I think the way that again, these are constructions that, in general,
the fact that they're constructions, but
no. But marginal groups aren't necessarily able to construct themselves, right? Obama may construct himself however he wants, and he clearly doesn't construct himself as mixed. But he is seen, like the interpretation of being the assumptions that he's a Muslim, the assumptions he can't be an American, all of those things are about him being constructed as not part of American society, or him being black, right? His blackness is the problem, and so he can talk about mixture till the cows come home, but the people who see him don't see him as anything other than black. I think that's the problem.
Okay.
Because he did. If you looked at his rich speech, that was the whole point. Is he engaged in this?
He did it maybe one and a half times, but I don't think he has generally. But that's another question.
But again, as given his position, where is he going to have that? So what's the context in which he's going to give that speech?
It doesn't have to give it a speech. It's the way he talked about the adoption of the dog was powerful. The president of the United States called himself a racial mutt, and it was sort of a really interesting moment in which he was delving in a very playful.
So then he did.
He did.
But not seriously enough.
Oh, but again, I don't know. We don't have to get into this, but again, you're ascribing no power to the most powerful man on the earth to define himself and to teach others how to define themselves, which is I find actually shocking. I mean, he could blow up the world over.
Limited power.
And yet he can't teach us about race?
A third of Americans think he's Muslim.
Okay.
He clearly has not had the power to do that.
Don, do you want to weigh in on this issue of Barack Obama and his very history and his very background is complicating our views of ourselves as Americans?
Well, there's a lot of discussion, of course, that we are in a post-racial era. And whenever my friends of color talk about that, it's don't be deceived is the basic line. And that discrimination is still something that is extremely present in an everyday way in their life. So I suppose there could be some question about how much the election of a black president has actually advanced us in this regard.
Well, I wasn't implying advance. It could be taking us back. I mean, has it, again, in Lisa's words, disrupted the discourse? Has it shifted our ways for better or for worse? I'm not implying progress at all. I'm not saying we're post anything, but has it forced anybody to look at the American family in any new ways, and the way that one might take a trip to New Orleans and take a plantation tour of a local plantation family and the black members and the white members of that family. That is a distinctly different view of how to look at race in that part of the country than we would have at a plantation tour in South Carolina. That's a different way of looking at the family, and given that a nation is in some sense an extended family. So is it forget progress? Are we entirely static? The election of Barack Obama to the presidency of the United States mean nothing racially? Is that the implication here?
If it didn't, it wouldn't have freaked out so many people.
Okay,
right?
so
I mean, but the fact of the matter is he's fundamentally centrist. I think he's in a very difficult position from a racial standpoint. I think he has to walk a very fine line. And so it's hard for him to do that work in the position that he's in because of the history, because it's new to people. And you know, I would say that all of that vitriol that came out in the town hall meetings and him being called a liar in the Congress, I mean, the things that have happened suggest that having his physical presence in that position disturbs people. That there is, not everybody, but that there are a core of individuals who are troubled by it. And so for me, that proves, because people argue, right, that it doesn't matter, that, you know, nothing has changed. I think it does matter, and I think if it didn't matter, you wouldn't have such strong, vehement opposition.
Right, but thus far, both of you mentioned negative reactions to. Is there anybody receiving positive reinforcements for? Is there anybody, you've both mentioned the negatives. Is there anybody who is not against Barack Obama because he's black, that may be challenged to relook at themselves and how they belong to the American family in different ways? Is there not another side of the story?
I can only speak for myself. And when he won the caucus in Iowa, I cried. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. So that renewed my faith in this country. I can't speak for African Americans. I would assume that other people had a similar reaction. But
I live in Altadena in a mixed neighborhood, and I can say when we went to the polling booth that morning to cast our vote for the president, first of all, there was a line around the block at 7 a.m. when it opened.
Yeah.
There was a euphoria that I think black and white together experienced. And speaking purely personal, I have two grandkids who are 1/4 African American. I think actually it will be an important part of their own, they're young, 2 and 5 years of age. I think it will be an important part of their own self-understanding. And they will see this as a historic moment, actually, as they understand themselves. But I'm speculating.
I think you mentioned to me, Don, at some point about age, the importance of age, and I'd like you both to comment on this. It's a pervasive notion in newspapers that young people are polling much more tolerant regarding race and ethnicity and religion. And is there any one in your estimation? Is this something to cheer about? Is it a blip? Do they change as they turn? Does it become 32? Do they suddenly change? What is the significance of age in the way Americans view difference and tolerance and pluralism?
Well, we of course don't know. That's the first answer.
It's always the problem with inviting scholars.
But I'm just going to speculate here.
what, you want us to lie?
When need be. Go on.
What we do know religiously about those who are in their 20s and let's take it from 18 to 30. That is a group that tends to be more secular, certainly, than their parents. They absolutely see religion as a choice, not something that they necessarily inherit.
Right.
It's a group that, on a lot of other measures, is tolerant. I see this just actually on the USC campus at lunch hour. Incredible mixing of people who, one, are dating, two, who are sitting together. There's a kind of casualness about this that certainly when I was an undergraduate, it tended to be much more segregated. My guess is that, at least just religiously, as they move on to different life stages, they're going to continue to think of religion as a choice and that they're going to honor everybody else's choice. There's obviously tremendous diversity, but to give a specific example, a year or so ago, I was part of a group of campus religious leaders from Ivy League schools, sort of very smart kids. they were all religiously committed, or they would not have been at this particular gathering. And what intrigued me was that they stood very firmly, whether they were an Orthodox Jew or a Sikh or a Muslim or whatever they were, claiming their heritage, but they were simultaneously equally interested and curious about the religious views and practices of others. And so I think rather than there being some kind of blending, we're going to homogenize religion and it's all going to feel and look the same. What I sense in the younger generation is we'll claim our religion or no religion. Actually, one of the religious groups at USC is the atheist group, which I think is intriguing. Certainly,
I'll ask you later why that's a religious group. Go on.
Because they needed a campus affiliation.
Right, okay.
But
Can an atheist get into a nonprofit break as a religious group? Sorry,
there's a
go on.
lawyer here.
I don't think
know.
God is required, is it?
Probably not.
I would think
Okay.
it would be required. So at any rate, my point, though, simply is for those who do claim to be religious, there seems to be, one, an affirmation of not polluting their own religion, but at the same time being tolerant of others. And then, of course, there are a huge number of people who are young people who claim to be spiritual but not religious.
Right.
And these are folks who are sort of religious dabblers of one sort or another, and what they hate is the institution of religion.
Right.
But they somehow recognize that a sense of spirituality is a positive thing.
But I do want to speak to the tolerance question, because no, we don't know, because the fact of the matter is there's a cohort effect, and so you can't just compare them to
Right.
older people because you don't know where older people were
Right.
at that point, right? But what we do know is tolerance comes from interaction, right? And not just interaction, but peer level interaction, right? Because the whole argument, if you have a white boss and a white boss has an African American employee, that's not the kind of interaction that's going to lead to actual mutual understanding. And so if it's true that young people are tolerant now, what's going to keep them tolerant is, in fact, if they're more integrated in their adult lives, and if they live in unsegregated neighborhoods, and if their children go to unsegregated schools, and they have diverse workplaces. And so I don't think it's an automatic that they're going to be tolerant. And actually, the most segregated group in American society right now is whites. So as long as whites don't have significant peer-level interactions with people of other races, I think it would be difficult to think that they would just automatically become more tolerant and have ways to counteract negative stereotypes about those groups. So I think we can't just sort of think like, oh, the young people are going to fix it all.
Right.
Because they love everybody,
right?
I mean,
But that's a tenor of a lot of news stories.
right? But the fact is, there are structures in society that either preclude or facilitate that, and we should think about building those in so that people actually engage with one another. Like in this sort of conference, people of different races, of different faiths, of different ideologies actually interact with one another, so that we can ensure that there is tolerance. It just doesn't come from nothing. Is all I'm saying.
I'm assuming that once upon a time, when I was too young to know, there was more talk about getting people integrating and desegregating. And
Yes.
is that something we still care about as a society?
I mean, there, at least in the education field, there are different schools of thought, right? Like some people say, in LA, if you're a Latino kid, you tend to go to a very highly segregated school. So some educators say, fine, forget it. Busing failed. We don't even want to have that fight anymore. Give us decent facilities and let us teach in our segregated school. And then there are other people who start charter schools that are either Afrocentric or Chicano-centric or whatever, who argue that students need that in order to develop their self-esteem. So I think there's different opinions about how you make that happen. But I think, at least in our current society, it is so segregated in so many ways that I think thinking about that as the political products of that.
And we don't necessarily, and you're implying that we don't have a consensus about whether that's good or bad.
Well, most people don't want to be told that they need to change anything about their behavior regardless of whether or not it's good or bad. I mean, I think that's what the whole busing fight made clear, right? That you can't, making that happen by force is very difficult.
And given that this is about the civic conversation, this is about ideally how changes in the way we look at race and ethnicity and religion might affect how we come together or not. Dawn, both of you, I'm hoping, Don, are we as a society interested in bringing together cross-racial, cross-ethnic, cross-religious conversations? But that's interesting. Lisa's last point is interesting, that we don't even, there's not a consensus even whether schools whether it should matter. Yeah. Does it matter in your mind, and should we be doing more to get people to crossing those lines?
Let me come out at this in a sort of backdoor manner. I don't want to give the impression that religion is somehow facilitating some kind of harmonious society in a very positive way and so forth. Because what is clearly true is that there are huge divisions even within a particular, not just faith group, but denomination. So whether it be Presbyterians, Roman Catholics, or any of the, or Jews, let's just take those as examples, there is a lot of polarization typically within those. So you have the very sort of orthodox conservative who are also tend to be politically conservative, and then on the other hand, you have very progressive. So they're poles apart, even though they're of the same faith group or even the same denomination. And actually, the bedfellows then tend to be among progressive Muslims, Jews, Christians, Buddhists, whatever it may be. And likewise, over on the conservative side, you get common bedfellows. Having said that, I think what's missing in all of this is we're starting to lose the middle. And we're getting a lot of polarization on either end. And so just as there's a sense in which we're losing the middle economically in terms of the middle class and strong polarization, the same thing I think is also happening religiously. So I don't know if that it doesn't maybe directly answer your question, but I wanted to sort of correct any perception that I was, to use a bad metaphor, whitewashing the religious community.
Right. And wondering, Lisa, if anything similar is happening in sort of the racial landscape, as Don's talking about for religion, the disappearance of a middle.
At least if you believe public opinion polling, there's no suggestion that that's true. What is true is you have a growing, if we just look, ideology is all over the map, and frankly, I think that the way we measure it is problematic, especially for people from other countries, because our scale is not other people's scale. So I don't put a lot of measure in that, but let's just go with partisanship, since that's a proxy. You talked about it this morning. There's a growing independent center. So in fact, the opposite. I think you have a growing middle. You have polarization to the extent, at least among Latinos and Asians, a movement towards the Democratic Party that wasn't necessarily clear would happen 10 years ago as a result of anti-immigration policies on the part of Republicans. So you kind of have a movement left, and a movement away from the right, but I wouldn't call that polarization. I think it's more just an ideological shift toward feeling like, well, these folks at least sort of want us to be here, whereas, and then the big middle who just feels ignored by both.
Let me just add another sort of complexity. We could take someone like Cardinal Mahoney, who just retired last Sunday, I guess it was. Yeah. So he's interesting. He's progressive on immigration issues. He's extremely conservative on same-sex unions and so forth. And so it's not that folks necessarily sort out on all issues, either on the right or the left. So it's a very complicated picture.
But he's Catholic, social service, unions, basic taking care of the poor. Catholics like that. They don't like sex, but they like, they like taking care of people.
Catholics don't like sex.
Well, they're not supposed to like sex.
You've seen the Monty Python movie.
I was going to say, though, on the polarization question, I did what actually annoys me that other people do is I left whites out of the racial equation, and I think at least in California, you do see a polarization among whites, and the fact that whites are much more highly represented in the Republican Party in the state of California than they are in the Democratic Party.
Which apparently we learned this morning is not a problem.
There were so many inaccuracies in what that man said this morning, I can't even, don't get me started. But the point is, you know, it is interesting that older white males are highly represented in the Republican Party. So the polarization that is happening is really whites fleeing to the right.
Right. And about 70% of evangelicals vote Republican.
Right.
Now, that is a recent
But not
phenomenon.
Latino evangelicals,
Clinton,
white evangelicals.
Didn't Clinton win the white
Not
evangelical
all
vote in the
evangelicals
90s?
Well, he tried to cater towards it. I'm not a political scientist.
I don't think
so
he ever won a majority
Really?
of white evangelicals, no. I don't think he
Significant,
ever,
no.
but he made inroads. He made inroads.
He didn't get into the 40s? Didn't Clinton do
I don't
well?
think he did that well. I don't think he did that well.
okay.
Because by then, you'd already had the moral majority and all that stuff.
Right.
You'd really had kind of the partisanization of that religion. But Latino evangelicals do not vote Republican, just so we're clear.
Right, so Catholics, including more...
They're complicated.
Yeah, they're complicated. They don't...
For the record, they like sex.
Or we
Hence
wouldn't,
all those babies.
we wouldn't have these high birth rates.
Right. No, but they don't fit neatly. Catholic ideology does not fit neatly into the American spectrum, right? If Jesus actually wanted you to help people, right? So that's the Catholic.
And black Protestants, even if they're conservative theologically or Pentecostal, tend not to vote Republican. So, yeah.
Because the head of the Republican Party in the state of California doesn't even know that blacks overvote rather than undervote for their socioeconomic status.
Don, you have a, well, I won't pick on you. We have sort of occasionally I'm thinking that we're so insecure now as Californians. Now people were gloating recently about the great weather out here. That's the one thing we can feel good about. But talking to you, Don, you still sort of you still seem to have a good pro Los Angeles bias to some of your thinking. And are you from LA originally?
I am.
So I'm going to appeal to your LA-ness. And I'm wondering. I mean, we used to like to think we were ahead of the curve, that somehow we were, you know, the great exception, that we were the rest of the country and if not the world followed us. Please tell me there's some truth to that and whether that's a good thing. Are we ahead of any curve on any of these issues? Don? Lisa, whatever.
Sorry.
Well,
Make me feel better.
let me say some positive things about religion. I think certainly, and we have an expert here, Bill Deverell, on the history of Los Angeles and California. But religiously, LA has been a real innovator and leader in many ways. I mentioned earlier Pentecostalism. So in 1906, there were the Azusa Street revivals about 2 blocks from here that now spread across the world. There may be as many as 500 million Pentecostals and charismatics.
It was a couple blocks from here?
Literally, yes.
What Senor Fish is?
It's right where the square is. I don't know what it's called, but it's here in Little Tokyo.
Okay, cool.
And there's a signpost right there that lays claim to it.
You never showed me that, Bill. Go on.
We have Amy Semple McPherson, the woman who started the Foursquare movement, who was an incredible performer. I think the first woman to be on religious radio. And I could keep sort of giving landmarks. We have...
And now?
And now we are innovators in terms of new hybrids. So we have Budeo-Christians, for example. And we have all sorts of interesting...
Is that a Hollywood religion?
Yeah,
I don't know, my daughter is a Budeo-Christian, so I don't want to say anything too negative about it. In other words,
this will be webcast.
Yeah, we have all sorts of reformist movements, and I would say we oftentimes do lead the curve. I don't know geographically, but I'll speculate we actually have more interracial churches in LA than in other parts of the country. So I think that there is something about the innovation of LA that is a cultural driver, and oftentimes, for good or ill, these things spread across the nation and the world.
So on the political side, I actually do have positive things. I think Villaraigosa in his second campaign articulated, you know, he's had trouble since then, but in that campaign, he articulated a different vision for progressive politics. Again, we're not going to talk more about sex, about progressive politics, and I think that's being enacted on the ground. So Scope, for example, which organizes in South LA, it was historically an African-American organization. Its community has experienced tremendous demographic change, as many communities have in Los Angeles. I have to say, Los Angeles now is not the Los Angeles I grew up in, for example, in terms of just racial demographics. And they have decided to embark on a multiracial organizing project where essentially they're organized, it's a place-based mobilization to basically say, so they run all of their meetings in English and Spanish. They have simultaneous translation going on at the same time. And their whole argument is we live in this neighborhood together. So black or brown, right, if we have environmental degradation, we're all going to be hurt by that. And so they go door to door and they talk to their neighbors in English and Spanish. And they talk about the ways in which it doesn't matter if you're African American or Latino or if you're an immigrant or non-citizen or if you're documented. The point is we all are in this together. And I think that is the future of progressive politics, and thinking about collectively, how do we meet, how do we talk about what we need, how do we lobby the state, you know, how do we lobby the state, how do we lobby the city to bring resources into our community at that very, like, we are all in this together. And so I think, I find them they make me optimistic about the potential for the future, to get past, talking about, like, how do you get past that discourse, is that it's not, yes, we respect each racial group and we understand we have different histories, but we are living in this neighborhood and we need to fix it.
You mentioned the mayor and the mayor of Los Angeles.
I think, yes, it matters that he was elected. I did phone banking for him, and it's the most positive phone banking experience I've ever had in my life. Usually when you do phone banking, people are rude, they hang up, it's awful. Here people are like, I'm so happy to vote for him, and I'll bring all my cousins, and I'm so glad Antonio's on the ballot. I mean, people were just so happy to have him on the ballot. It really mattered, and I think that has to still stay. But I think also he articulated a progressive vision that was really about basic well-being and taking care of everybody, and breaking out of this idea that you're either a Latino mayor or an African-American mayor. And you know, I think he actually did a very nice job of articulating what you could call kind of a post-racial politics, but really talking about, you know, basic, like, we should have a social safety net and we should have education for our children, and it helps us all. And so I think in that way, if we can move that forward, that will have mattered.
And to his credit, I might add, he did that in sort of in opposition to a media that wanted him to be the Mexican mayor. And he would push them back and say, I'm not the Latino mayor. I'm a mayor for all Angelinos. He had to make that point come across, and he did a very good job of it.
And I mean, he had an incentive because liberal whites in the West Side didn't vote for him the first time. He needed to get them to vote for him the second time. But I think him having done that, he won the Jewish vote in the West Side. He needed a bigger number. That was anyway.
I think we've touched on a little bit of everything. I don't think we've gotten to the problem of civic engagement utterly, but now Ralph Lewin is here, so we did a great job. And I can attest to that. I thought of the thought before I saw Ralph walking in. But I'm hoping that you'll all have some questions for our panelists regarding their given expertise. I'd like to open it up to any questions.
I think that black people are more nationalistic. At least my age black people are more nationalistic. And I am nationalistic, black nationalistic, in the sense that I think, in spite of all the interracial mixing and this and that, ultimately, black people are likely to end up isolated and alone in America's new racial mix. And therefore, I would like to see the maintenance of a kind of racial solidarity as a defense mechanism, because I think a multiracial America is still likely to be more hostile than not to African Americans. So I just wanted to have both the personal in Obama's dilemma, which he's resolved in a way I find satisfactory, and then my own personal dilemma. When people see my granddaughter, they know she's mixed with something, The Latinos, when they see her, they know she's mixed with what? Mexican. They say, oh, so that complicates both her personal life, I think, my granddaughter's life, as well as my own.
Well, and just to make it even more complicated, she probably has black on the Mexican side, because the Mexicans don't talk about that, but there was large African influx in Mexico.
Dawn?
How old is she now?
She's 5.
A lot of white Anglo churches have tremendous guilt that they're not interracial. However, there's obviously a counter argument that the black church historically has been the institution that developed and maintained the culture of black people. And therefore, my friend in Irvine, who has a mixed black-white congregation, could even be perceived as doing a disservice because clearly the songs, the message, a lot of things are now black-white as opposed to maintaining black culture.
Right. Well, and not just that, talking about civic engagement, the black church, even in the current day, is seen as a major engine for African-American civic engagement and civic orientation, and so that would be lost as well, or at least diluted, right? Because you don't have that sense of solidarity and community if the community is more mixed.
Any comments or questions, sir?
The vehemence with which the right wing of the Republican Party is attacking the president, just your opinion, how much of that do you think is based on their objections to his philosophy, so-called left-wing focus, or how much of it is based, again, in your opinion, on racial discrimination?
You're asking.
That's your question.
That was not my question. Are you asking me?
I'll take a stab at that question. He's not left-wing. Okay, can we just lay it out there? He's never been left-wing. If you look at everything he's written, he's a centrist. Right, he accepts many Republican ideas. He's never been left-wing. So the argument that it's an ideological problem, I think is unfounded. The reality is this is a party that the last time they were out of power also lost their minds. So there is something about Republicans out of power that creates sort of extreme politics, and that was true under Clinton as well. So I think some of that is just a repeat of what happened under Clinton. But the vitriol, them spitting in the face of John Lewis in front of the Congress when they had the Tea Party, I mean, that level of just anger and hatred, I have no other, it's absolutely irrational. People telling him to go back to the jungle, you know, the things that were on those signs that folks feel, I almost feel like his election has somehow opened up this place that people now feel comfortable because on some level, because we have a black president, we're not racist, and therefore I can say these things that you couldn't say in the public discourse before. I think just that level of animosity and hatred that has been expressed toward him by, granted, a very small sector of the population, has no other explanation other than racial discrimination, at least that I can find.
Don?
I completely concur with that, and I'm searching for whatever the psychological term is.
There's a racial threat hypothesis in social science.
But the idea is if you can't be, I mean, obviously there's some instances of overt racism, but if you can't on a regular basis be overtly racist, then there are more subtle ways that may actually intensify the vitriol. And so it seems to me that absolutely is occurring.
Sir?
I just happened to be at USC recently for a film, and I ran into Tom Hayden, and I asked him a question about the Arizona. You know, what do you think about Arizona? And immediately came out of his head, you know, not even 3 seconds after I asked, he said Mississippi 1961, which is 50 years ago. And for some reason, I hadn't given it a thought, but it just rang so true to me. We are living in Mississippi 1961 as far as I'm concerned. And I hadn't thought about it, but when Tom Hayden would have been part of the Freedom Riders and all that kind of stuff, when he said it, it just rang so true.
You have a comment, question?
Well, mine was just sort of a follow-up on the earlier discussion. I think
part of it, the people, particularly not on the West Coast, see Hawaii as another country too. And so,
or a nice place to go on vacation.
yeah, but it's not America, right? I mean, there are Asians there, and there are Hawaiians there, and I think it's a complicated. It's racism, but it's xenophobia too, at a certain level, and the whole Kenyan connection and the birther movement. Not, I mean, it's clearly racist, but I think it's a complicated kind that goes by way of Hawaii and Indonesia.
Mr. Denrow.
I think that question gets at something that I've been puzzled about the recent political dynamics where Arizona, Alaska, and Hawaii seem to be playing an inordinate political role, which is remarkably Western. I mean, as Western as you can get, basically. I'm just curious if Lisa's thought about this in political science literature. Are we seeing, for instance, with those three places being so dynamic, maybe misunderstood, but so dynamic in the political debate, are we seeing an inordinate amount of power to three sparsely populated Western places that are being brought into the national debate as proxies or even as driving certain levels of the national debate well beyond their size and their political import?
And again, I lived for 7 years on the East Coast, and having grown up in California, it wasn't until I lived there that I realized how little power we have over here, despite the size of our state. And I have a feeling all those powerful people on the East Coast are just looking at these states, shaking their heads, going, there they go again. Like, but I don't get the sense that they're central, right? Other than as, Palin, right, as an individual. I don't see Alaska as central in the same way.
Except that, the way I sort of phrased it in a sense is that we have now political figures who wrap themselves in the culture of those places and say, this is or isn't a true America. Arizonans, John McCain is an Arizonan, Sarah Palin is an Alaskan, Obama is somehow a questionable American because of his specific roots.
Right.
If I may, I actually work for Arizona State University as of a couple weeks ago, and I do spend some time there, and I do begin to think about it a lot. And my estimation of the problem in Arizona is not racism per se, and if it is racism, it's not the kind that was faced in the early 1960s in the Mississippi Delta, which I've also spent a lot of time in. The Mississippi Delta was a place where blacks were a large majority, and they had been since the 1860s. And they had a small white minority who was solidified and threatened and felt surrounded and was very cruel.
And armed.
And armed. Well, but no, they weren't all armed. That's actually, no, I actually sat down with the founder of the White Citizens Councils. He never got up a gun, and they were the most effective oppressors. It was to them, the KKK were just the guys that did the dirty work. The real evil, the Citizens Council, these guys, they did a lot through pressure.
But some of them did commit violence.
In any case, yes, I'm sure they did. But the point being is, my estimation of what's happening in Arizona is not it's about white. It's about white alienation. It's about white angst. Whites are at a different place in their evolution and their sense of self. They are feeling beleaguered in part not because it's just simply demographics. These are whites who moved to Arizona. These are whites that chose to live there. These are whites that are feeling uprooted, who don't have a sense. They're post-ethnic whites. You ever been to a resort in Arizona with all the faux Indian and faux Mexican? It's a fabricated culture in which they're actually looking for ethnic roots. No, worse than, even now it's more contemporary. California's examples, as Bill has written about, are previous eras, but now this is very alive. And it's very much, they're making these shopping malls right now. And there's a sense of post-ethnic white angst is what I ascribe it to. And so there's no sense of who they are. And so I argue that it makes the threat toward them. And it's back to this amazing book that you probably know. It's a sort of whiteness in the making of Arizona. I don't know if that's not really the title. And in essence, the territorial, the man who led the territory and went to whatever House Select Committee that was looking at whether the territory should become a state, argued that we're not really from Arizona. we're from Baltimore, and Pittsburgh, we're white like you. So the very origins of Anglo presence in Arizona has always been an insecurity about becoming more like the dark people. So the very basis of Arizona, the establishment of the state, included a white insecurity of being too far from white power and not being white enough. So that's my estimation. So it's a different state of white anxiety, and it's a one we're going to see more in the post-ethnic era. So as we see whites becoming more and more distant from their immigrant roots and their sense of their Italianness or their Irishness or whatever it may be, you're seeing whites grasp and be more threatened because they've lost their own sense of collective identity. And the head of sociology at Harvard, Mary Waters, wrote this amazing book called Ethnic Options, in which she's showing that latter generation whites are essentially, you don't like that book? Oh, I thought it was lovely. But anyways, the sense that there's a sense of emptiness to a whiteness that in her mind leads them to glom onto older, now sort of older ethnic identity. I would argue that whiteness then and the feelings that you don't have a collective identity that warms you actually leads you to ideology, it leads you to Sarah Palin land, and it leads you to feeling very threatened by the encroachment of non-whites. So that's my take on it. And I did that so perfectly that there's no time left. Anyway, any more questions or comments?
I'm wondering, you know, in my lifetime, I think the greatest national level of civic engagement I saw during the Obama campaign, and certainly in the electoral process. And, you know, I know that many of us understand that there's not the same level of activism once the campaign is won or the election is won and there's disappointment between candidate Obama and President Obama, but where have you seen bright spots of where that momentum has continued post the election period with the new...
The midterm elections?
Pardon me?
That was a joke.
with people who got involved in civic engagement for the first time, of which there were many during the 2008 election.
I don't see any.
My sense is there's a lot of disillusionment among youth, I mean young adults who gave everything for that election, some of whom now occupy various posts within the administration, particularly in the faith-based sector, actually. There are a lot of Du Bois, his faith-based guru is 30 years old or something. But I don't see them, one, exercising much power, actually, and the large masses, I think, feel betrayed.
I guess I have a slightly more positive spin in the sense, sort of two things. His campaign showed that community organizing was important, which is something that has not been true. Political consultants have basically been fighting against for the last 30 years. So the principle that you have to have organizing on the ground, the principle that you have to have, you know, an infrastructure and a base of volunteers, and so there's a whole movement of voter mobilization work coming out of community-based organizations that got legitimacy and access to funding as a result. And so you have a lot of cooperatives here in California, actually, that are working basically bringing different funders together to actually to do mobilization work in between elections. And the argument, you know, that you can't just sort of bridge it, it's not just about elections, but really thinking about politics as cyclical. So I think all of that kind of came out of that excitement. So while there's not the direct, you know, those people are not necessarily now becoming, you know, leaders, I think there's a movement of how we think about organizing our campaigns and our electorate that is different from what was before, and that gives me hope.
Thank you very much for joining us.